Synthwave is basically a reimagination of the 80s atmospheric electronic music. Or to be more precise, it is a type of music similar to what you hear in the movies, TV shows, and video games from the 80s. Although the genre itself was introduced in the 2000s, and it was kind of a niche genre for a while, but somehow it's been always present. If you see the famous neon artworks, the animated fast cars, and the flashy metallic letters, you'd probably feel like you've seen those all your life, even if you didn't live through the 80s. In 2011, Kavinsky's Night Call became a hit. The song was featured in the movie Drive. And in 2016, the first season of Stranger Things came out, and the soundtrack of the show, which I think is heavily inspired by Synthwave, made more people interested in the genre, especially the younger generation. In terms of how Synthwave sounds and how it's made, it usually has a tempo around 80 to 110 BPM, although some tracks might be faster. The kicks are punchy, but they're not heavy. In other words, unlike many other genres of electronic music, kicks are not one of the main characters in Synthwave. Although I must say, if you make the kicks right, they can really help bring out the 80s vibe. But the snares are definitely very important. They're often very thick, and it's common to put a reverb on them. And then in order to make a synthwave track sound rhythmic and groovy, you can either use a short bass sound or a synth arpeggio. The main melody in synthwave tracks is often played with a bright electronic lead sound, and there is also usually a line of string pads to help with the atmosphere of the track. I'm gonna talk more about the sound design in a few minutes. For now, I think this is a pretty okay explanation of how synthwave sounds. This is of course a very basic structure for a synthwave track. There are countless other things that you can add to your track to make it sound bigger and more creative. The use of electronic sounds in the 80s movies and TV shows is a continuation of the works from the previous decades. For example, the work of Wendy Carlos on A Clockwork Orange that was released in 1972. That's exactly one decade earlier than the release of Blade Runner that was scored by the great Vangelis. When you listen to the soundtrack of A Clockwork Orange, although the sounds are made on synthesizers, there are times when they don't feel like electronic sounds. They sound like they come from instruments, but at the same time you can't tell what instruments can make those kinds of sounds. Also, the music works very well alongside the classical pieces that we hear in the movie. So I think the composer had to find just the right spot for the music to sound more modern, but not completely alien to what was perhaps the more conventional way of making film music at the time. The movie itself is very unusual and crazy, and the opening theme really prepares you for all the madness that is about to happen. I mentioned that because I think a lot of filmmakers got to realize the potential of electronic sounds precisely because of earlier works like that. So in the 80s we had way more movies and shows that used electronic sounds in their soundtracks. And it wasn't limited to only science fiction works. Even crime movies like Scarface had an electronic soundtrack. And of course, the show Miami Vice, which is a famous cop show, and the story takes place in Miami. And a lot of the visual elements of that show had a big influence on the synthwave aesthetics that we know today, like the colors, the outfits, the palm trees, and the cars. Speaking of visuals, synthwave is definitely a genre where the music and visuals always go hand in hand. Neither one gets in the way of the other one. They complement each other. And it's usually that color palette of pink, blue, and yellow, characters that are strange and cool, the futuristic metropolis, and the famous sunset. And this world that has been created for this genre, this nostalgic and yet futuristic world, makes a perfect match with synth sounds. And in terms of sound design, all the electronic sounds that we hear in the 80s pop music and film music were created on earlier generations of synthesizers. And those synthesizers were not only still available and used in the 2000s, but some are still used today. Perhaps one of the most notable examples is the Yamaha CS80 that Hans Zimmer used in the Blade Runner 2049 soundtrack, which was also used by Vangelis for the original Blade Runner movie soundtrack. I've heard multiple composers describe the sound of those older synthesizers as warmer and slightly inaccurate in terms of playing notes, but the kind of inaccuracy that's actually good. And some even claim that you can't get those kinds of sounds from modern synthesizers, which I disagree because I think electronic sound design is basically programming frequencies to behave in a certain way, and you can definitely create those kinds of sounds on modern synthesizers. But maybe you have a personal interest in those vintage synthesizers, or instead of recreating their sounds, you just want to save time and use a real one, which is of course worth the experience. Either way, I think synthwave has been making a lot of progress over the years. and it has stood the test of time. And I love the fact that it's been such an interesting and relatable genre. Every time a synthwave track becomes a hit, it inspires other artists to explore the genre and come up with new ideas to update it. And it's interesting because the genre itself was inspired by a version of the 80s that never actually existed, and yet every shade of this genre makes everyone feel nostalgic, and at the same time, it always feels like a breath of fresh air. Please name your favorite synthwave tracks and albums in the comments. And if this video was helpful, please consider subscribing to the channel. I want to make more videos about different genres, so if you have any suggestions, let me know. See you in the next one.